Hey there everyone. In this video, I would like to discuss the role of sadomasochism in Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow. Now, I'm going back through and reading this work the second time, and I'm really astounded by, first off, Pynchon's artistic brilliance when it comes to penning some of these passages. We'll read some of these just to see the profound aesthetic sense behind Pynchon's writing. And what particularly strikes me that I really wasn't getting the first time I read this book, because I was kind of in this autopilot mode of realizing I needed to let go of the reins that is my need to understand and comprehend everything. And I just had to kind of be along for the ride, just let the reins go which way they will. And as a result, I wasn't really getting a lot of the historical criticism of the Nazis, for example. This is a somewhat common criticism of Gravity's Rainbow, is that it seems to skirt past things like the Holocaust or skirt past an explicit condemnation of the Nazis. And after reading part of it the second time, and I'm still making my way through it, which is why I say part of it, it's so clear to me that that is an incorrect criticism that comes from not reading closely enough, because we are really seeing in Gravity's Rainbow a critique of the way modernity burgeoned into all sorts of sadistic schemes, such as the military-industrial complex, or the Nazis, or colonialism. And it's a very deep critique of Western society, really. I mean, it could go for humans in general, but looking at the historical development of things like states, for example, and nationalities and various technologies, looking at these historical developments and really critiquing a lot of the underlying social impulses that are allowing for the development of things like war. And we're really going to see a fascinating thing take place in Gravity's Rainbow, which is that things like war or death take on a sort of autonomous role. They seem to detach themselves from the agents which carry out death, such as technology or indeed individual drivers, because you have things like the V2 rocket, for example, which is not guided by a human. It's guided by its own internal computer and telemetry data and all this, and it has a gyro inside that kind of makes it this isolated system that can correct for perturbations in the air and whatnot as it's flying, and it is able to basically be freed from the previous constraints on the ways in which we could kill each other. And in that way, Gravity's Rainbow is extremely self-critical. It's critical of itself and its own style, particularly the notion of meaning and whether or not there can be any meaning in modern society. It's very self-critical of the society that it comes from. And the role of sadomasochism is something that figures fairly prominently in Gravity's Rainbow, but it can seem out of place. I definitely was having trouble nailing down exactly what Pynchon was trying to deliver with these themes of sadomasochism the first time I read Gravity's Rainbow. But now coming back, I realize the way in which it represents one of these possibilities to responding to the sort of rationalization of modern society, the way rational systems develop in historically contingent manners in ways that often restricts individual human possibilities. And in the face of this, the characters throughout Gravity's Rainbow are concerned with what sort of strategies they can maintain that will have some sort of longevity, that will get them outside of this black hole that is history with a capital H, or society with a capital S, or even the West with a capital W. It's a way to try to basically brainstorm how to get beyond unitary totalizing systems. And the kind of quintessential example is the Argentinian anarchists in Gravity's Rainbow, who are kind of one of the first members of the counterforce, quote unquote, that we learn about in Gravity's Rainbow. And they, in many ways, represent the anarchic impulses of the counterculture of the 60s and 70s in America and in Europe as well. And Pynchon is really trying to wrestle with, one, what do those sort of projects look like? Do they have longevity? And two, how are they responded to and systematically dismembered historically? And as we look at the role of sadomasochism, we're going to see one of these strategies, which is very controversial and very violent, in fact, and see what sort of implications that has for the future development of, for example, German society into the Nazis and things like that. Now, looking at episode 14 of the first part of Gravity's Rainbow, this is the longest of part 1 of Gravity's Rainbow, of Into the Zone, but it's filled with so much symbolic meaning, and we are basically building up this kind of character complex of Dominus Blicero, Katje Borgesius, Gottfried, and Enzian. And these characters are all related in very interesting ways. And we're starting with Katje, and it's really interesting that this chapter opens with, in silence hidden from her, the camera follows as she moves deliberately nowhere, long-legged about the rooms, an adolescent wideness and hunching to the shoulders, her hairy not bluntly Dutch at all, but securely in a modish upsweep, with an old tarnished silver crown, yesterday's new perm leaving her very blonde hair frozen on top in 100 vortices, shining through the dark filigree. So right, he's just got this really, first off, beautiful style, but second off, we are instantly keyed into these cinematic metaphors of being followed by the camera and this sort of circumambulating our perspective, almost boxing us into some sort of closed system in which we are at the behest of the laws of that system, which is something that's going to develop with this analogy of the oven. And as we develop, we're with Katje Borgesius and Osby Feel. And there's this really beautiful kind of vignette of the environment that they're in. Outside, the long rain in silicon and freezing descent smacks desolate, slowly corrosive against the medieval windows, curtaining like smoke the river's far shore. This city in all its bomb-pierced miles, this inexhaustibly knotted victim, skin of glistening roof slates, sooted brick flooded high about each window, dark or lit, each of a million openings vulnerable to the gloom of this winter day. The rain washes, drenches, fills the gutters with singing. The city receives it, lifting in a perpetual shrug. And I love this aspect of Pynchon's writing. The environment always feels alive. The gutters themselves are pathways for the singing of the universe itself, and the city gladly receives this. And this is one of the things that we see pressed against the characters throughout, is learning how to receive and accept that which is in all of its ugly contradictions. We get this beautiful vignette of Katje. The cameraman is pleased at the unexpected effect of so much flowing crepe, particularly when Katje passes before a window, and the rain light coming through changes it for a few brief unshutterings to murky glass, charcoal saturated, antique and weather-worn, frock face, hair, hands, slender calves all gone to glass and glazing, for the celluloid instant poised. The translucent guardian of a rainfall, shaken through all day by rocket blasts near and far, downward, dark and ruinous behind her, the ground which, for the frame's passage, defines her. And I really like the attention to detail that is being put on our female character here, because another critique of Gravity's Rainbow I've heard is that, and this kind of goes for all the characters being kind of weak, but specifically that the female characters are weak, that they are subordinate, that they aren't strong or powerful. I totally disagree with that. All of the most amazing characters are alive and are female. I'm thinking of Greta Erdmann. I'm thinking of Katje Borgesius. They are such strong characters, so beautiful in a way that's not gendered in and of itself, right? It's just this beautiful kind of camera-like gazing at the beauty of this spectacle. And indeed, spectacle is a good way of putting a lot of the imagery in Gravity's Rainbow, because we're constantly being faced with whether or not something is kind of an authentic thing or not, whether or not it is an image or a phantasm or a fantasy or a chimera, all these different things. But one thing that's very interesting for her is she feels enclosed in the soigné surface of dear fabric and dead cells. She is corruption and ashes. She belongs in a way none of them can guess, cruelly to the oven, to der Kinderofen. Remembering now his teeth, long, terrible, veined with bright brown rot, as he speaks of these words, the yellow teeth of Captain Blicero, the network of stained cracks and back in his night breath, in the dark oven of himself, always the coiled whispers of decay. So we're getting this very ominous, very ugly image of Captain Blicero. And Blicero, etymologically, is coming from Teutonic mythology, where Blicero means death. And Dominus Blicero, which is another of his names. He's also Captain Weissmann later, the white man, which is very symbolically significant. But Dominus is Latin for Lord, so Dominus Blicero is Lord Death, which has this almost comic book hilarity to it. It's very on the nose, and yet at the same time, he's such a detailed character. And as we continue reading, we see that Katje is basically a sex slave of Blicero. And Blicero is this ugly guy who has created this sort of weird sadomasochistic triangle between those two and Gottfried. Gottfried meaning God and freedom in German, which is very interesting. And we constantly see that Gottfried is the butt of all these sadomasochistic endeavors. So God and freedom are always being punished in these weird ways, being subdued. They are always something which Blicero wants to show that he is above Gottfried. That each utterance is a closed flower, capable of exfoliation and infinite revealing. So there's this potential that Blicero seems to see in their sadomasochistic endeavors, which are quite gruesome. For example, tiny blades of stainless steel bristle from lifelike pink humidity, hundreds of them, against which Katje, kneeling, is obliged to cut her lips and tongue, and then kiss blood abstracts across the golden, ungesewed back of her brother Gottfried. Brother in play, in slavery. Which is really horrific, right? We have this obsession with blood, but also this notion of union through the sadomasochistic endeavor. And this is something that I'm thinking of, for example, the Marquis de Sade. There is a strange sense in which violence gets rid of rationality or the imposition of representational frameworks. I remember kind of a meme of the only time that we are fully in the moment today as kind of 21st century individuals is when we're throwing up, because we're not on our phone or anything. Our minds can't be anywhere but on the act of throwing up, on this bodily affective experience, which forces us out of rationalizing things and just into living them. And that is similar to what a lot of theorists of sadomasochism have pointed out, that it is, ideally at least, and it's not in Gravity's Rainbow, supposed to be a consensual endeavor in which pain becomes a transformative experience taken together. And Blicero represents this kind of need for an authoritative position which rises above all this death by controlling it. There's this constant need for control and for ensuring that all these kind of spare possibilities are neatly packed together. And we get this really kind of symbolically significant, very, very phallic and very masculine image of Blicero. His face, for that first time, seen in autumn sunlight through the great west window of the drawing room, kneeling naked except for a studded dog collar, masturbating metronomic at shouted commands from Captain Blicero, all his fair skin stained by afternoon, a luminous synthetic orange she has never before associated with skin. His penis a blood monolith, its thickly gasping mouth audible in the carpeted silence. His face raised to none of them, but as if to something on the ceiling or in the sky, which ceilings may in his vision stand for. Eyes down, as he seems most of the time to be. His face, ascending, tightening, coming, is so close to what she's been seeing all her life in mirrors. Her own studied mannequin stare, that she catches her breath, feels for a moment the speeded percussion of her heart before turning just such a stare toward Blicero. He is delighted. Right, so Blicero is watching over all of this, right? We've got like BDSM with the dog collar and all that, and Captain Blicero is watching over it, and he has this sort of deathly stare that he imparts, this symbol of authority. And Blicero is going to take this to all sorts of levels. For example, Gottfried and Katje will mix up their clothes such that Katje is clad in boys' clothes and Gottfried in women's clothes. And there's this blurring of gender, but, as Pynchon writes, afterward he must always go back into the cage. That's how it is. Their captain allows no doubt as to which, brother or sister, really is maidservant and which fattening goose. So there's this always need to kind of control things and box it up and make it very neat and tidy. And this need to make things neat and tidy is a human impulse that Pynchon wants to zoom in on a little. And it's the subject of the book in general that he mentions. And it happens very early on when they're talking about how they're going to condition Slothrop. There is always this sense of needing to impose order on something that doesn't promise itself as ordered already before the act of ordering it, or makes it meaningful before the act of making it meaningful. And Pynchon uses this as a way to critique and poke at the reader by creating this very formally complex work, this very symbolically complex work. Even in terms of the plot, it just kind of fizzles out towards the end, such that it's now just a series of very loosely, if at all, associated vignettes. And this is all to try to focus on the need to impose order. And that maybe this is not in and of itself bad, but it can be used in the creation of very deadly systems. In a conquered country, Pynchon writes, one's own occupied country, it's better, Katje believes, to enter into some formal, rationalized version of what, outside, proceeds without form or decent limit day and night. The summary executions, the roustings, beatings, subterfuge, paranoia, shame. Though it is never discussed among them openly, it would seem Katje, Gottfried, and Captain Blicero have agreed that this northern and ancient form, one they all know and are comfortable with, the strayed children, the woodwife in the edible house, the captivity, the fattening, the oven, shall be their preserving routine, their shelter against what outside none of them can bear, the war, the absolute rule of chance, their own pitiable contingency here in the midst. So we can quickly see that sadomasochism is a form of systematized distraction and desperation. It's a way of symbolically building up an edifice that can act as a routinized shelter against the threat of, getting bombed by a V2. Like, all of this is very important. And we see, for example, the ways in which V2 rockets often fail. Pynchon mentions how no bearing is exempt. Often the rockets, crazed, turn at random, whinnying terribly in the sky, turn about and fall according each to its madness so unreachable and, it is feared, incurable. And this madness permeates through Pynchon's universe, and he's trying to imagine, what is it like to come to terms with this madness? Is all change a form of madness? He quotes Rilke from the Sonnets to Orpheus, "Want the change, oh, be inspired by the flame." And he continues, "To laurel, to nightingale, to wind, wanting it, to be taken, to embrace, to fall toward the flame, growing to fill all the senses, and not to love because it was no longer possible to act, but to be helplessly in a condition of love." So this is the ideal, is to be in love and embrace the change, to be inspired by the flame, which, for people like Heraclitus, fire is the image of change and becoming, the constant flux in the universe. But, as it's mentioned, Katje probably fears the change, choosing instead only trivially to revise what matters least, ornament and clothing, going no further than politic transvestism. And this is a reference to the fact that she becomes a kind of complicit Nazi in certain senses. She is helping to find and send to the gas chambers various Jews. And this is, of course, something that one has always wondered since World War II, is how did ordinary people sink to such lows as is the case in World War II in the Holocaust? How is it that normal people could do that? Well, one of the answers I think Pynchon is trying to give is that change is something which is feared. And there's this sense of invincibility or naivete that comes from the romanticization of death, which Pynchon really wants to key in on. And this is coming right after the stuff on Rilke, so I think that's important to keep in mind. But Pynchon writes regarding Blicero, he can do nothing. Among dying Reich, orders lapsing to paper impotence. He needs her so, needs Gottfried, the straps and whips leathern, reel in his hands which still feel her cries, the red welts across the boy's buttocks, their mouths, his penis, fingers and toes, in all the winter, these are sure can be depended on. He can give you no reason, but in his heart he trusts, perhaps only by now, in the form. This out of all Märchen und Sagen, trusts that this charmed house in the forest will be preserved, that no bombs could ever fall here by accident, only betrayal, only if Katje really were a spotter for the English, and bade them, and he knows she cannot, that through some magic, below the bone resonance of any words, a British raid is the one prohibited shape of all possible pushes from behind, into the oven's iron and final summer. It will come, it will, his destiny. Not that way, but it will come. And this understanding of destiny is something that you can see very prominently in German Romantic, late Romantic, early modern writing, is this obsession with what does this destiny entail? Is it something that cares for humans? Is it something that allows for our transcendence? Or is it something that leads us to kind of this monotony of modern life, this inescapability? Pynchon continues, und richt einmal sein Schritt klingt aus dem tonlosen Los. Of all Rilke's poetry, it's this 10 elegy he loves most. Can feel the bitter lager of yearning begin to prickle behind eyes and sinuses at remembering any passage of the newly dead youth embracing his lament, his last link, leaving now even her marginally human touch forever, climbing all alone, terminally alone, up and up into the mountains of primal pain, with the wildly alien constellations overhead. And this is the translation of the German that I had just read. And not once does his step ring from the soundless destiny. It's he, Blicero, who climbs the mountain, has been so climbing for nearly 20 years, since long before he embraced the Reich's flame, since Südwest, alone. No matter what flesh was there to appease the witch, cannibal, and sorcerer, flourishing implements of pain. Alone. Alone. He doesn't even know the witch, can't understand the hunger that defines him or her, is only in times of weakness bewildered that it should coexist in the same body as himself, an athlete and his skill, separate awarenesses. And this is really fascinating, right? We're seeing this soundless destiny as something which is akin to a mountain that Blicero sees himself as being able to triumph above. This is something which he sees as being in control of, which is, of course, exactly what, for example, the war with the capital W would want one to think, right? We want to feel in control, but as Gravity's Rainbow tries to show, we're not in control, such that technology seems to take on this autonomous existence. Markets burgeon and develop to the point that technological innovation becomes something beyond the individual consent of any one person, but becomes this collective chimera that we cannot escape. And Blicero is thinking about this development of his actions as a Nazi engineer. And he imagines that eventually he'll be saying, it's reflexes, you see, not me, just the reflexes. When did it begin to change for Blicero? Among those days, from lust to simple sorrow, dumb as Rauchenandel's amazement with his own talent? He has seen so many of these Rauchenandels, especially since 39, harboring the same mysterious guests, strangers, often no more bizarre than a gift for being always where shells were not. Do any of them, this raw material, quote, want the change? Do they even know? He doubts it. Their reflexes are only being used hundreds of thousands at a time by others, by royal moths the flame has inspired. Blicero has lost, years ago, all his innocence on this question. So his destiny is the oven, while the strayed children who never knew, who changed nothing but uniforms and cards of identity, will survive and prosper long beyond his gases and cinders, his chimney departure. So, a Wandervogel in the mountains of pain. It's been going on for much too long. He has chosen the game for nothing if not the kind of end it will bring him, nicht wahr? Too old these days, grips taking longer to pass, stomach too often in day-long agony, eyes measurably blinder with each examination, too quote-unquote realistic to prefer a hero's death or even a soldier's. He only wants now to be out of the winter, inside the oven's warmth, darkness, steel shelter, the door behind him in a narrowing rectangle of kitchen light gonging shut forever. The rest is foreplay. And we're seeing how this complacency from, oh, it's just reflexes, develops into this burgeoning system of motives, of this collective complacency leading to a number of agents who willfully do these painful things, which is, for example, putting children into the oven, that is the gas chambers. And we can see that he's not explicitly mentioning that it's the gas chambers, because this image of the oven, I mean, right, this is this vestibule for transformation and change, but it's also violent and deadly, which is exactly the point of the V2 rocket in Gravity's Rainbow. So this change, this flame, is actually something quite deadly that other moths are led to, and they go down this path that they didn't even decide. They just happen to be stuck up in it. And of course, in this passage, it's supposed to be applying to the Jews going to the gas chambers, but even more, it applies to Blicero himself, to the so-called innocent Nazi engineer. Nevertheless, he seems to care about the children whom he leads to the gas chambers. He returns again and again to the waste and senseless image of what was a house in the forest, reduced now to crumbs and sugar smears, the black indomitable oven, all that remains, and the two children, the peak of sweet energy behind them, hunger beginning again, wandering away into a green blankness of trees. Where will they go? Where shelter the nights? The improvidence of children, and the civil paradox of this their little state, whose base is the same oven which must destroy it. Right, so this oven is the image of sadomasochism, of the virility, of masculinity, of power, of control. And this is something that the characters in Gravity's Rainbow are trying to wrestle with, trying to squeeze something out of. And indeed, we see this culminating in Gravity's Rainbow with Gottfried being forced into the V2 rocket and being shot off into the sky to his imminent death in this mock pseudo-transcendence, which in fact is not going to transcend the Earth's gravity, for example. It's going to come right back down and lead to the death of both Gottfried and others. So in this we see the death of God, which is doubtless an allusion to Nietzsche, and also the death of freedom itself. Freedom goes out the door with these systems, these monotonous systems that in the place of these modern rational systems, all sorts of strategies are put forward, one of which is, as crazy as it may sound, sadomasochism. That being said, I hope this has been helpful and interesting in terms of understanding Gravity's Rainbow. A lot of this can be very jarring, not only emotionally, but in terms of just following the plot. So I find that it's helpful to talk about these things and kind of brainstorm them. So hopefully I can add something to the online discourse regarding Gravity's Rainbow. Feel free to check out any of my other lectures on postmodernism, German idealism, gender theory, post-colonial studies, and other classic literature. You can become a channel member for $5 a month and gain access to, among other things, a private philosophy Zoom, which you can tailor to your needs. I also have super thanks available if you'd like to donate to the channel, because books are not cheap, and I'd appreciate anything you have to give, but no pressure. That's it for this lecture, and I will see you in another one.